Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Taxes was taxing. Now taxes is relaxing when you file for free.
I can file for free? TurboTax Free Edition. Roughly 37% of filers qualify. Simple Form 1040 returns only. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free. I can file for free.
Now this is taxes. File for free with TurboTax Free Edition and get your maximum refund. No schedules except for Earned Income Tax Credit, Child Tax Credit, and Student Loan Interest. See if you qualify at turbotax.com/free.
Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan Mader.
But what's more impressive to me about the
Chase Thornton.
Yeah, I mean, I got him.
Chris Dowhouse.
Get him, Chase. Get him, Chase.
And Adam
No,
LaRue.
not necessarily, but it's again the same.
Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
All right. We're back here on a Wednesday night, a little earlier than we're used to, but that's all right. Hopefully catch us during your dinner hour on the East Coast, and maybe you're just getting out of work if you're sitting there on the West Coast. Operation Domination in the house. Thanks for tuning live on our YouTube channel. Be sure to catch us on your favorite podcast app so you can listen to us on the go. I'm your host, Dan Mader, joined here with Adam LaRue and Chris Dowhauer, and a special guest we'll introduce in just a second. We are talking about the NFC West. Today is the last episode of our team profile series before we get into the nitty-gritty of full-fledged draft season. Training camp 1 week away. So we're wrapping up exactly at the right time. But with no further ado, let's get our guests introduced. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Sitting at the top right corner of your screen, the one, the only, the legendary, the host of SiriusXM and that football guys, FSWA Hall of Famer, Mr. Bob Harris.
I just recorded that so I can use it everywhere I go. Most notably the grocery store. And I appreciate you guys going early tonight. I'm quite old. Bedtime's very early. Everyone knows this. So appreciate that acknowledgement.
Hey, anytime that we can actually make our schedule accommodating to you, the guests, then that's exactly what we want to do. Oh, by the way, we have Chase in the building at just the nick of time as we jump into Kyler Murray, because we have no time to waste in this show. It is jam-packed because the NFC West covers like half your fantasy football landscape, and your drafts coming up this season right now. So we got Kyler Murray, like I said, in the building. All of us have him as a top 12 quarterback, bare minimum. Bob, you got him at 8, feeling pretty strong about him. What is it about Kyler Murray that you like heading into this season?
Feel like I might feel stronger about him as we get closer to the season. Look, I mean, he's obviously been very good at points in his career. We've seen him have a quarterback 2 or 3 finish there in year 2 under Cliff Kingsbury. I know this is different offense. Drew Petzing. I was surprised last year he came in after an offseason spent rehabbing the torn ACL and ran an offense that he had never run before pretty confidently, right? I mean, he came in and just like went out. He started 8 games, threw for 1,799 yards, 13 total touchdowns, 10 passing, 3 rushing. But the final 4 games of the season were really impressive. Completed 70.3% of his passes, 935 yards, 7 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. The Cardinals led the league in total offense with 400 14 yards per game over that stretch. And Murray was quarterback 7. So, expecting him, and look, they have new weapons. One named Marvin Harrison Jr., maybe Trey Benson. I don't know if I expect much from him this year. I still think James Conner has a year left. We'll talk about that. But Trey McBride, so there are pieces there. I go back to something Ian Hartitz wrote a little while ago from Fantasy Life, and I think he finished quarterback 2. It was a 24.2 fantasy points per game average. He's one of just 7 quarterbacks who averaged more than 23.5 points per game in a single season in the last decade. So you're looking at a guy who could throw for 4,000 yards, rush for 500 plus yards. I think I might almost be low. I might be talking myself into a higher ranking even as we sit here.
Well, I got him the highest ranked at 6, but first I want to hear Chase's thoughts. You're a little bit lower, Chase. Is there some kind of caution there in the wins? Do you have him right sitting at 10?
Well, to kind of piggyback off what Bob said, yeah, I might actually feel better about him the closer we get to the season here. Yeah, he's got some new weapons, so we're not sure. We all think we know what we're getting with Marvin Harrison Jr., but we don't necessarily know yet. There's a lot of, they vacated 2 of their top 3 receivers. There's 163 targets that are empty and waiting to go around. I expect most of those to go to Harrison, but the fact remains he hasn't played it down in the NFL yet. But Kyler Murray, like Bob said, he missed half the season, came in halfway through the year, basically cold, learning the offense on the fly. And we all know the jokes about Kyler Murray and watching film and how much he studies, but he looked like himself stat wise, at least from the very beginning. And then the last half of, last quarter actually of the year, but last half of his year, yeah, he really started to come on and looked just like the Kyler Murray we've seen before. His top target earner from last year, Trey McBride, will still be back. This is his 2nd year now post ACL surgery. So that's usually the year we see guys who are runners, get comfortable making all of the cuts and making all of their plants and that. He's still a top 5 caliber running quarterback when he has the ball in his hands, I think. There's nothing but upside here, I think, with Kyler Murray. And, his ADP right now is quarterback 10, but yeah, he's got top 5 ceiling. So he's one of those guys you could wait on and you could really find yourself happy with him come playoff time.
Yeah, I think what was most impressive to me was the fact that he comes off the ACL injury and it didn't hinder him as a rusher. 5.5 carries a game, 30.5 yards per game. Just to give you an idea what the 17-game pace on that would be is 94 carries, 518 yards, and 6 rushing touchdowns. And that's coming right off the ACL. Chase, you touched on it. He's a year removed now. And he didn't look much different as a passer in the new offensive system halfway through the season. That's why, for me, I got him at 6. We've seen Kyler Murray finish in the top 5, two finishes in the top 5 over the last 5 years, in fact. And he was QB 9 on a points per game basis from week 9 week 8 when he came back and started. So I don't know what the downside is for Kyler Murray other than you're worried about him getting injured again potentially, but I think that was really impressive that he came back and fired on all cylinders. Let's dive into our next quarterback. That's Brock Purdy. Now, with Purdy, we know he has all the weapons. We know he's in the offense. We know last year he finished as a QB 8 on a points per game basis. Chris, you're the only one of the group that doesn't have him inside the top 12. What is it about Purdy you think might regress this season?
Well, as I was kind of alluded to, I think this might change as we get closer to the season. But for right now, what I'm looking at is the guys between 12 and 14 that I think are kind of sliding around for me, where I have a Trevor Lawrence in there, I have a Brock Purdy in there, and I have a Tua Tagovailoa in there. Guys who I think have upsides, all guys who I think I've seen produce. Now it's a matter of what do I think is going to project next year. Purdy's that guy that I'm a little worried that we might have seen the ceiling last year, Dan, in a lot of ways. We saw over 30 touchdown passes. We saw over the 4,000 yards. We saw the high production week in, week out. We saw a guy who, is pretty consistently getting you over 20 points a game. Didn't have a super high ceiling. Didn't get you over 30 points once, last year. Isn't a guy who's going to necessarily dominate a week for you, but is a guy that you like as your quarterback 1 option. So for me, I have him as right outside that, QB1, borderline option. So I think right there that last starter kind of in those 12-team leagues is kind of where I'm debating some guys. And I have him just a little bit lower where I like Trevor Lawrence's upside, especially rushing potential, but higher. But at Brock Purdy's a guy I can see easily sliding up there. I'm waiting, Dan, also to see what kind of happens with this Brandon Aiyuk situation. I think if they lose Brandon Aiyuk, that's going to be a huge loss for this passing attack. I think Brock Purdy has a chance to have more attempts this year, but like I said, the efficiency was incredible last year. So will the numbers really change that much?
The efficiency is incredible, and it's going to be that balance. So they get a little bit more volume. Bob, you have him at 12, so you do have him as that last starter in your 12-man league rankings. Talk about that a little bit.
I think Chris really nailed it. I mean, the big issue for him is you don't have that rushing equity that you're going to get with some of the other quarterbacks. I do feel like if he slid a little bit more, that would make me happy. And he may well. We're sitting here talking about our rankings July. Some of this is like, I think we'll all acknowledge is flag planting a little bit on some players that we like, but there are players I like I have Jaden Daniels ahead of him. If I was like getting Jaden Daniels and I wanted to be super comfortable at the quarterback position, I might come around, double tap and hit like a guy like Purdy, or there are others. Trevor Lawrence is a guy that just mentioned that I think like a year ago we were talking about him as an ascending talent in a great offense. And if were it not for some injuries and poor offensive line play, maybe he would have been that. So there's a whole wealth of quarterbacks available later. But give me the one in the Shanahan offense, playing with a great supporting cast, and we'll see. We'll talk about Aiyuk, but I think we tend to get a little bit overheated about these things. The public portions of negotiations are always the most contentious portion of negotiations, and while the work and the concerning thing about that, there's no work apparently being done behind the scenes at the moment. There is no negotiations, but we'll see. The 49ers have a tendency to drag these things out and make everybody super nervous. That's last year's Nick Bosa, or a couple of years ago Deebo Samuel, same situation. So we'll see how it goes. But I like it's the Shanahan offense, and Shanahan has the perfect automaton, and I say this in the nicest way possible, the mini Shanahan running his offense. This is what Kyle Shanahan always wants. He wants himself or a factotum of himself on the field running his offense, and he's got that.
Yeah, he's always wanted that. He's always wanted that. It's funny that you mentioned Purdy and Jaden Daniels. That's actually like been my biggest best ball strategy throughout the entire summer, is double tapping Jaden Daniels and Brock Purdy and pairing those two up for the upside play and the floor play that you get at the quarterback position. I'm just going to point this out. With this supporting cast, and I'm kind of with Bob here, I don't see a scenario in which Brandon Aiyuk's not on the San Francisco 49ers, at least for this season. And assuming that with the addition of Ricky Pearsall, I don't see him getting below 30 passing touchdowns. And I use that quite a bit as a barometer. And in the last 10 years, there's only been two quarterbacks that have thrown for 30 touchdowns that have not finished inside the top 12. It was Ben Roethlisberger. He went over 30 back in 2020. He finished as QB 14. Kirk Cousins went 30 exactly in 2018 and finished as QB 13. So kind of just mapping out the two guys who didn't finish inside the top 12 were still inside the top 14. So you're working with the safe floor there, and he's going to be hovering, I think, around that mark, safe to say. Matthew Stafford is somebody that we want to get into too. He's a great NFL quarterback, but somebody who maybe doesn't necessarily finish in that top range for you for fantasy purposes. And all of us pretty much have him in that QB2 range. Adam, you got him at 18. What are you looking at for Matthew Stafford in your preview this season?
Yeah, this is a weird offense in a lot of ways. Just you have the two great receivers, you have the great running back, but there's some question marks on both of those ends. You've got a quarterback that, I'm a massive fan of Stafford, and I have been for a long time. But the reality of the situation is we haven't seen the rankings here over the last two seasons really since
Check engine light on? Take the guesswork out of your check engine light with O'Reilly Veriscan. It's free. Ask for O'Reilly Veriscan today.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
The first season in LA, and then it had been a couple years, and then we're going like almost 6-7 years back before we've seen it in Detroit. So we have one great year, his first year in LA, and then since then fantasy hasn't really been the strong suit. For him, I actually think that there's a chance for a positive regression as far as touchdowns go, because he was a really efficient passer, especially at the beginning of last year, and just not seeing touchdowns. So I actually wouldn't be surprised if that ticked up. I just don't know that I like his upside as much as other guys in this range. He falls in a really competitive tier of quarterbacks for me. And then it falls off a cliff pretty shortly afterwards. So I think he just falls at the back end of a tier where I think he is similar to guys around him. I just haven't seen it from him in longer. So he kind of falls to the back of the group.
I got to say, I'm not here for this DeMarcus Robinson slander I just heard, Adam. I'll accept your apology now. There are three good receivers now.
He has been one of those guys that you always find yourself talking about the waiver wire, right?
Oh, yeah.
I was like Jordan Rodriguez wrote about him the other day, saying he seems to be aging in reverse, and it is kind of true. But that late season run he had was super impressive, and I think it is worth noting. I mean, that might give them an additional weapon and something that gives you a little more. I mean, I think we're all comfortable with Stafford where he's going. Like if you end up landing him as your quarterback too, you're going all right, and probably deal with it. And they're going to be good weeks. But definitely that receiving core. We always say this every year going in, like, well, if this guy's going to be wide receiver 7 and this guy is going to be wide receiver 2, somebody's got to be throwing to them. It doesn't always end up like turning out that way, right? So I think we're not being over enthusiastic is correct, and I apologize for my Demarcus Robinson rant out of nowhere.
Dan, can I jump in real quick?
Sure, go ahead.
The one thing I just wanted to say is one thing I think the upside, that maybe Adam alluded to for Stafford is what Brock Purdy was able to do with that 49er offense. You see a lot of similarities. 2 receivers you can feature, running back that you're going to look to get the ball to. Is it going to be efficient? Is it going to be huge upside? No, you're not going to be 50-point games. But Stafford's one of those quarterbacks I feel like you can trust the floor where he's going to get gross to 300 yards per game. He's going to get a couple touchdown passes used, most of the time. So it's not a guy who's going to have a super low floor and does have a pretty solid ceiling where you can get similar. You talked about that 30 touchdown passes. Matthew Stafford getting 3 touchdown passes is definitely not out of the realm of possibility where he could be that top 12 guy.
It's not out of the realm of possibility, but even though he's had great weapons throughout his career, he's only done it 3 times in his 12-year career. That's been kind of the downfall of Matthew Stafford, is he hasn't really hit that mark very consistently. I think to your point of the floor, he's something we're always going to be talking about as a streaming option, right? You get stuck in a hard place, one of your quarterbacks goes down, he's somebody you could kind of pick up and stream off the waiver wire because he is going to have that offense. The best thing about Stafford, I think, is just because he's such a great NFL quarterback, he does great things for our fantasy assets that we really care about as we go into throughout this show. I guess quickly, we'll talk a little Geno Smith, even though it's not going to be too much of a factor. I think for fantasy drafts in particular, if he does make an impact, it would likely be off your waiver wire. But Bob, this was a guy who finished as a QB5 2 years ago, QB8 on a points per game basis. Then last year comes back, he's QB25. Do you see any room for going back to what he was a couple of years ago, or is Geno Smith kind of is what he is?
100% room for him to go back to where he was because Ryan Grubb is why. We'll talk about this with his receiving assets as well. He's another guy he's got all this receiving talent. What are they going to do? We've seen a run-heavy Seattle offense in the past under Pete Carroll and the previous coordinators, whether it's Shane Waldron, who probably didn't want it to be, and Brian Schottenheimer, who probably didn't know how else to do it. It's going to be a different offense that we're going to see. That said, if they're going to throw the ball a ton, we'll see if he's up to it. This regime is not Mike Donald, the new head coach, and he's not have any allegiance to him. They brought in Sam Howell, who threw the ball a hell of a lot last year, and so they've got plenty of arms. And so I think that's the biggest concern right now. Are they 100% sold on him? If things get tough, will they be willing to move on? See what they have in Sam Howell seems likely.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility too. One of the things that stick out to me that I have concerns with Geno Smith being able to bounce back is that his play in general is not just a touchdown regression. His play in general really kind of suffered from year to year here. I mean, his red zone completion percentage, as we know, with the touchdowns went down. It went from 17th to 27th. The biggest concern I had was his clean pocket percentage went from 3rd to 22nd. That's really not a good mark. So those things have to really be able to bounce back, I think, for him to be able to bounce back. But let's get into the running backs of this NFC West division and start off with none other than CMC. Everyone has him at number 1, except for me. Look, I wish there was a 1A, 1B situation here that I could put. I don't really want to say Christian McCaffrey is my number 2 running back. I would put him 1A, 1B with Bijan Robinson. I'm looking at Kyren stats, who we're going to talk about in a second. I'm kind of projecting those tendencies on the Bijan with his youth, with not having as much concern about the team actively not wanting to overwork him, like the 49ers don't want to overwork Christian McCaffrey, and that's ultimately my tying factor. Am I going to be shocked McCaffrey is number 1? No, I'm not going to be shocked if McCaffrey is number 1 overall. But Bob, a few comments on him because he is getting a little bit older. He's coming off a season with over 400 touches total, and you still have no concerns.
No, none that I didn't already have, and those concerns are always there. Something you said, like Kyle Shanahan talking like we want to lighten his load a little bit. 272 carries last year, tied for second most in the NFL, the most touches. And sure, they would like to not give him as many touches. I wrote about this at Football Guys last week, and I said it like this. I also would like to eat less cake. Yet when presented with cake, I turn in a clean plate every single time because cake is fantastic. So is Christian McCaffrey. It's going to be hard for them to take you. You don't take your most dangerous weapon off the field except when you can. And so maybe we see a little bit of that, but I don't think enough to keep him. The key for me is he is a player and a half. And at what level is he a player and a half? Running back 5 last year was the guy who he was player and a half over. I mean, that's a huge leverage over the field. I'm not going to, if I have the first pick overall, I'm not going to give up on that. It's not happening. And like, we all know what can happen. Jonathan Taylor would like us to know that running back, given the consensus running back 1 can have a down year, right? So it can happen, but it's hard not to invest in it for me.
Well, and for him, it wasn't just the volume, right? He was amazingly efficient.
Yeah, super good.
Yeah, first in evaded tackles, 5.4 yards per carry, 6 yards per touch, 4th in breakaway rate. So he could get less touches, be just as efficient, be much of a scoring monster. Again, this is me just pumping up Bijan, not trying to pump down Christian McCaffrey.
Well, Breece Hall's number 2, like Andrea says. Everyone knows that. Come on.
No. Breece Hall's my number 4. I got him actually 1 spot below Jonathan Taylor. I don't get too much of a tangent on it, but he is going to see less catches this season. Doesn't mean he's not going to be
not going to get those 90 targets. That's true.
No, he's not. But let's keep it in the NFC West because we don't have too much time to go on a tangent, unfortunately. Kyren Williams, he's somebody we need to talk about. Big, controversial flag planter, if you will, like you said early, Bob, for a lot of people in this one. Adam, you got him at RB13. You're the lowest of the group. You're the only one of the group who has him outside of the top 12. So speak to some of the concerns you have about him being a top 12 running back in ADP.
Once again, can't label me a Notre Dame truther. Every time we talk about draft prospects, I come in the lowest on Kyren.
He's no Audric Estime. You're right.
Exactly.
Right. He's no Audric Estime.
No, look, I love Kyren. 2 things, and one of them we're going to get back to here in a minute. This whole tier of running backs is one that it's the tier that I think of any position group, any tier is the one that I'm going to tinker with the most going into the season, just because there's a lot of old guys, a lot of guys in competitions, a lot of X, Y, Z between like 8 and 18 in the running backs. There's a lot of movement that could happen. So I want to throw that out there. And for Kyren specifically, my biggest concern is that kind of what you were saying with Christian McCaffrey, the exact reason that they drafted Blake Corum is we have this small dude that we need to give a ton of volume, but also we're a little afraid of giving him volume. And I hope that they come to the same realization that you did, that Kyren's awesome. Let's just give him the ball. I'm afraid that what we're going to see is the frustration of, there's the Kyren long run and Corum's coming in to punch it into the end zone, because that's of the areas that I see Corum potentially having either an advantage of or being, I think they're similar players in a lot of ways, but if you're looking for a potential advantage for Corum, it's probably on the red zone, to be honest with you. And I could see not necessarily, he's the goal line back, but if Kyren got us here and we don't want him to be worn down, him maybe getting the end of drives sometimes, especially coming after long runs, things of that nature. I don't necessarily think that, again, he's going to steal touchdowns as a goal line back, but I do think that, you could see him snipe some touchdowns that in annoying fashion. But we'll see. I want to see how, through camp, that relationship ends up being, what that usage ends up being. So,
and to be fair, you are highest ranked on Blake Corum out of the group of us, which makes sense with your consistency there where you have Kyren Williams at. Bob, anything you want to add to that?
Again, if smart drafters are chasing volume at the higher end of the running back ranks, if you believe that Kyren Williams is going to get the 20 plus touches a game he got, or better still, the 25 a game he got down to the final 5 games, which allowed him to be running back 2 over that span, then you're going to be super happy. If you think Blake Corum is a threat to that, I know, one other possibility is the games he missed, the 4 games he was on IR, they lost 3 of those because they couldn't run the football. I think that's why Blake Corum is there. That doesn't mean that's the only reason Blake Corum is there and that he can't at some point cut in the workload. And that's the obvious concern here. Can Blake Corum cut in the workload? The history is going back to Todd Gurley. McVay picks a lane and he keeps driving that same, he'll drive the wheels off his guy. So that's the hope. If you're on the optimistic side, if you're on the other side of that and you fear Corum, it's understandable. If you want to draft Corum late for the contingent upside, which would be about an 80% share of that workload, if something were to happen to Kyren Williams, I am not against that either.
Yeah, I think everybody would agree that Blake Corum, at the very least, is a 1-for-1 handcuff for Kyren Williams. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And look, if you want to make the argument, some have, that Blake Corum is more talented, we'll have to wait and see. He hasn't played a snap yet in the NFL, and Kyren Williams is pretty productive. But you can make the argument Blake Corum was a better athlete in his combine profile, but so was a lot of people over Kyren Williams in the NFL. So kind of take that for what you will. I do think Blake Corum, at the very least, is a 1-for-1 handcuff. We'll see if he works into the workload, but I'm with you, Bob. Sean McVay, typically, if he has a guy he trusts, now he didn't fully trust Cam Akers. That was part of the problem. If you have a guy he trusts, he usually sticks with that guy until the wheels fall off. To Adam, to your point, I think the question is, do the wheels fall off and does Blake Corum run away with the job at that point? That remains to be seen, but I still like Kyren in the top 10. When we move on to Seattle and we talk a little Kenneth Walker, we are a little more spread out on the board in this one. Chris, you have him actually inside your top 12, despite the coaching change, despite you still have the factor of Zach Charbonnet, who of course is going to work in at least to some degree. So what makes you confident about Kenneth Walker as a top 12 running back?
I don't know if I'm super confident in him. Kenneth Walker to me is one of those guys that's that RB, 2 option starting off that RB2s that you're happy with. He's got the upside to be an RB1. He's got the floor to kind of be at least be a flex option for you. But he's one of those guys that you're still kind of to determine what's going to be on the offense. But what you did see in Washington is, they're known for their passing attack. They usually featured one running back. They were able to utilize their running attack pretty efficiently. They were able to utilize their guys for lots of touchdowns. Dallas Johnson had over 16 touchdowns rushing, I believe, last year in college. So it's something they do look to utilize as guys. My concern overall is, of course, the Charbonnet usage. But, Kenneth Walker is a guy that I feel like, Adam talked about, is one of those running backs in that second part tier where it can kind of slide up or down depending on what I hear out of camp. But a guy, as long as he's the starter in the offense, I think going to be pretty productive. I think he's got an opportunity to be effective. He's got those, even if he's a guy who only gets 15 touches because of the explosiveness, he might be able to still be a good threat for you to have in your offense. So I don't love upside as a RB1 per se as a touchdown opportunity guy, but as a guy who I feel confident in my lineup week in, week out, Kenneth Walker is one of those guys.
Now, Bob, do you see it any differently? Not that you're not confident in him, but you do have him more as a back in RB2.
I think so. I'll go with this. I think he's the level of talent is there. Chris's number is the talent. The role and maybe the anticipated workload for me maybe diminishes a bit here with Ryan Grubb coming in. And we'll see if Charbonnet can cut into it. I mean, this is also was a thing that was great about Pete Carroll was he would get his guy and then he would draft another guy who everyone would be scared of, but Pete would stick with his guy until he could not stick with him any longer. And then the next guy comes up and then he would draft another guy to make you nervous about that guy. So, but yeah, so I think that's the range of outcomes for Walker is yes, he needs some big plays. Also, he's capable of delivering those big plays. The offensive line was a little bit suspect last year. Maybe it'll be a little better this year, but I'm worried about the change of offense. And that's why my ranking is, I don't think it's the talent level. I think it's the scheme level for me.
Chase, you have him ranked in the exact same spot. Do you want to add anything to what Bob just said?
No, I agree that his talent level is that of reaching into RB1 territory. I just, I don't think they would have drafted Zach Charbonnet a couple years ago if they thought that Kenneth Walker could do it all the time and be that workhorse running back that you have to be to break into number 1 territory. I'm comfortable with him as my running back 2, but I can't go any higher than a mid to low running back 2, and that's just his role, unfortunately. And with the new Ryan Grubb offense, if they want to, this is a team that ran the ball the second fewest times of any team in the NFL last season. We don't necessarily expect them to be winning all of their games this season, so they may be behind. They may be passing more anyway, let alone then we talk about Ryan Grubb's offense coming in and Kalen DeBoer's offense, I guess you could call it actually, but I just don't see necessarily the role there for Kenneth Walker to elevate him past a mid to low running back 2 at this point.
Yeah, just to give guys some ideas, if you don't already know what the splits kind of were between Walker and Charbonnet last season, Walker out carried Zach Charbonnet, a 67 to 34% split on the ground. Their target share was actually about the same, 8% target share each. Now, Zach Charbonnet ranked 8th in the NFL in routes run and 11th in route participation. He was on the field much more in passing situations. It just didn't lead to additional target share. And the big thing is the new regime change, right? We don't know how this new regime are going to view these two running backs and how they're going to utilize them. We know that Kenneth Walker has been was the guy last season, is exposed enough to where we expect him to be the starter at the very least, right, for this upcoming year. How much Charbonnet gets into that, nobody truly knows, but we know Walker's exposed enough, as Chris mentioned, that it's unlikely, I think, in my opinion, that he would lose that job barring injury. But I will say with Zach Charbonnet, kind of like the Blake Corum situation at the very least, I think we do view him as a 1-for-1 handcuff. Last year, weeks 12 and 13, when Kenneth Walker missed, Zach Charbonnet was the RB16 over the course of those 2 weeks, getting 18 opportunities and 21 opportunities in those 2 games. So we know if something happens to Walker, Charbonnet is very capable of handling an all 3 down back workload. Now we get into our first showdown of the evening. All right. You guys know how this works. If you're part of the Operation Domination show, we're going to present our 2 cases. And in this case, Bob's going to be the one judging the argument between Chris and I over James Conner. And we're going to try to tie in a little Trey Benson analysis in that as well. I am the lowest on the board here. Admittedly, on James Conner, I have him ranked at 27th. Chris has him at 15th. So we're operating on 2 very different tiers here at an RB3 and a mid-level RB2. So Chris, why are you confident in James Conner again this season?
Well, I liked what I saw last year, Dan. Number one, he averaged 5 yards per carry, which is pretty impressive for a guy that we're trying to knock him for being older or going to lose his job possibly this year. Usually guys that average 5 yards per carry go over 1,000 yards is kind of hard to replace. And is at the floor. I think James Conner showed you at the end of the season, a 5-game stretch there where he had 22.5, 16.4, 19.7, 25.8, and 28.4 for your life playoff run. That's a nice little playoff run, a guy that you had for James Conner, an offense that we saw Arizona kind of find itself. Even with Kyler Murray, throwing the ball more often and doing different things that we kind of talked about earlier in the show, James Conner was still very effective. And what we saw him be effective with is running the ball down very effectively, but he also caught the ball in the backfield, which James Conner can do. So I look at a guy as one of those last of the opportunities be the bell cow backs. I just want to clarify something too. Once we get outside the top 5, basically, running back situation, you're going to have a lot of guys who are going to be 65-35, 60-40. That's going to be the norm moving forward. So I'm looking for the guys who are going to have the upside with that 60%, 65% touches of things. And this is where I see a guy that I think at least he's going to have those touches barring a major injury. Trey Benson is a good player. I think he'll be factored in. But we saw last year Michael Carter got factored in towards the end of the season. We saw DeMarco get factored in, 2 weeks previous to that. So they were involved in the passing attack, they're involved in the rushing attack. To say that they got about 10, 12 touches combined between the 2 running backs was about what you saw. So there is room for James Conner to have some things taken away from him as well and still eat. I'm not aiming him to be quite as high as he was last year, like I said, but I feel like a guy that I have a pretty consistent feel for as long as he's healthy. And that's a key thing for James Conner, so I can't argue that strongly. But if James Conner is healthy, and look at a lot of other names are getting drafted around the same time he is, a lot of guys have injury questions too. I'm going to deal with the guy that I liked what I saw most on tape last year and a guy who I see upside in his offense.
Yeah, I mean, look, Chris, there's a few things that I do agree with you, despite having James Conner ranked much lower. He did look impressive towards the end of last year. I think you missed the drop the mic moment. He was RB1 from week 13 on. He was very impressive towards the late end of last season. And of course, his efficiency was the best it ever has been in his career. I mean, he had 5 yards a carry, and that's way over what he's usually at, which is usually 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, somewhere in that range in his first season going over 1,000 yards. So I don't disagree with anything there. My ranking of 27th for James Conner is not so much a reflection of what I think you're going to get on a week-to-week basis when he is healthy and playing, or throughout, let's say, the month of September, maybe even October. You're going to get probably more closer to where you have him ranked at RB15 in production during those weeks. And last year, he finished as the RB9 on a points per game basis. But it was all due to that late surge from week 13 on in that 5-game little stretch. In the first part of the season, the first 12 weeks of the season, he missed 4 games, which I'm going to touch a little bit more about that in a second. But even the other 8 games during those first 12 weeks, he was only the RB 36 on a points per game basis. So it was a very uneven season for James Conner. Yes, he did much better once Kyler Murray started to get back into the mix a little bit more, and perhaps he was a little bit healthier. I'm not going to knock him too much for that, but he is turning age 29. This is a running back who's never played an entire season. And I think more so this is what would deter me and why I have him ranked at 27th and more concerned about over the back half of the year. Because he's a player who has missed now 4 games in back-to-back seasons, it's not a matter of if, but when he's going to miss time. Trey Benson is a talent profile that hasn't been around James Conner for quite some time. He represents more of a threat than we have seen. I didn't realize Chris has jumped off the screen here. Hopefully we'll get him back in just a second before the showdown's over. But he is somebody who represents more touches to be taken away from James Conner than what we've seen over recent seasons, especially while he's been in Arizona. So here's my thing with Conner. While he would get injured, it was never a question as to whether or not he will get his job back when he's ready to come back. I think that can be more of a question now. James Conner's on the last year of his contract. Normally speaking, that would actually be a positive for me, but because I don't think the Cardinals are in a position to be winning now, they may look at it and say, hey, if Trey Benson comes in while James Conner's out and he's playing a hell of a game, they may look to move this offense forward with their future stars in Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison and Trey Benson, and he kind of gets phased out as a result because of whatever time he missed, and Benson looks impressive. I think it's more of a threat than it has been in years past. So that's why I have Conner more ranked at 27th, reflecting what I think might happen over the second half of the season, potentially. I thought I was going to have Trey Benson ranked the highest of the group. Actually, Adam does, but I do have him inside the top 40. So with all that, Bob, you go ahead and judge the debate here.
I'm glad Chris made it back for this epic win. It was a destruction of Dan. It was horrifying to see. I feel bad. I was shedding tears as I saw how badly Dan was getting beaten. No, like obviously the range of possible outcomes we have covered quite well. You got a bad day to get an injury agnostic judge. But you know, and we'll talk about Trey Benson. But anytime you have a guy, when we're talking about the speed, when there's a 3 after the 4, I get really excited. And so I'm excited about Trey Benson at 216 pounds. I think this year his best hope is as a receiving back, third down back, barring something happening to Conner, which, you laid it out. It does happen. I'm hoping it doesn't happen. I like him as a running back too. I think, coming off the career year, he said it the other day. We mentioned the floor. He said that is the floor. We're offense that Drew Petzing brought with him that makes the difference for me.
Yeah, you can't argue with that necessarily there. Chris, you get the win on that one. There we go. Now I can turn my sound effects up. That's better. All right, so with that, we can go ahead and get into the wide receivers with another showdown. Chris is once again going to be involved in this showdown. This time he's going to be taking on Chase. Bob, once again, you're going to be judging this whole thing to see who you agree with more. Chris hates Puka Nacua. He has him ranked at 17th. Oh my God. Ooh. Maybe we'll tie it a little bit Cooper Kupp here during this debate. We'll have to see. Chase has him all the way up at 8. So we'll start with Chase. Chase, you have him at 8. Why are you confident Puka Nacua can replicate what he did a year ago?
Well, it's not just me. It's pretty much the industry. Whether you're a professional, whether you're outside of it, his ADP and his ECR are both right there around wide receiver 7. He's going 10th in drafts. He's a first round pick almost across the board. People are expecting that. Now, listen, it's a lazy and easy thing to say that, oh, well, he got all his points because Kupp was injured at the beginning of the year. Listen, in the games that they played together, Puka Nacua still out-targeted Cooper Kupp, okay? In the games that they were both on the field together, he still had more targets than Cooper Kupp. So it's not unreasonable to think that over the course of an entire season, if Cooper Kupp can stay healthy, that could repeat itself. Now, granted, Puka Nacua's targets did drop in those games by a whole target a game. He went from averaging 9.4 targets a game to averaging 8.5 targets per game. Okay. But even if you take those targets away, if he can score at a similar rate to last year in terms of his points per target, he still was a top 10 scoring wide receiver. Even if you take that basically one target or so a game away, he still was a top 10 scoring receiver. There is still more room for him to be used in the red zone. Remember, he only had 6 touchdowns last year. There is room for him to positively regress up in his touchdown count. And, bottom line is Puka Nacua, he's not the fastest receiver in the league. He's not the tallest. He's not the strongest. But he does a very good job of winning against man and press coverages. He gets open, and he's perfect for what Sean McVay wants him to be doing in this offense. When he runs the routes that he runs most often, he wins those routes, and Stafford does not miss him. And he can run those routes from all over the field, from any of the 3 receiver positions. He doesn't have to just play one or the other. He can play outside. He can play that big slot inside and take over for Kupp if need be. He can play anywhere on the field. He can play in the backfield and go in motion. He's a perfect weapon for what McVay wants him to do in this offense. Matt Stafford is still there. Cooper Kupp is going to be 31 years old, and I just think that there's no reason that Nacua can't repeat his same level of performance from last year. He may not end up wide receiver 4, but that's not where I have him ranked. I have him ranked as a wide receiver 1, and I think that's exactly what he'll be at the end of the year.
Okay, Chris. So why do you hate young guys? Just because you're old, you got to represent the old guys? What do you got over there?
No, this is me pushing back at the industry, as Chase kind of alluded to with the Puka Nacua. This is the flavor of the month. The newest guy. Who's the newest guy that we want to go love so much and make him replace the old guy? Because that's what we love to do in America.
Marvin Harrison.
And well, I think right now we're looking at a guy that Puka Nacua was very good, and I'm not going to question that at all. And I think 17 is pretty fair of him. We see usually that receiver 2 in an offense finish around that range between 15 to 17, which is pretty high for a second receiver. What I do knock on him is the range where he can finish when he has those targets you're talking about, Chase. He had 160 targets last year, had 1,480 something yards, 6 touchdowns. Are we going to see more of that? More yards, more projection, attempts or carries? More? What are we going to see more of Puka that has, us excited that he's definitely here and arrived, that he's going to replace Cooper Kupp as the number 1 in this offense? Because when Cooper Kupp was the number 1 as that offense, we saw him put phenomenal, ridiculous numbers up in 2021 and like in 2022 in a second. Let's stay with Puka Nacua last year. He had 4 games where he finished outside the top 50. For a receiver 1, having 4 games outside the top 50 is pretty hard to swallow. Now, he did have 6 games inside the top 10, so there's opportunity for that improvement. As you talked to Chase, here's the upside. But when we saw Cooper Kupp have similar targets and be that number 1 receiver in this offense, Cooper Kupp in 2022 never finished outside the top 20. He only played 9 games. He got hurt in the 9th game. The 9th game. But he played 8 games. He was 3 times he was in the top 5, 6 times in the top 10, and 19 the other 2 times. I bring that up because in 9 games 2022, where the 30-year-old Cooper Kupp's getting so old now, he's starting to lose a step. That was what we saw kind of the floor. Now, 2023 last year, he comes back. And it was 5 games towards the end of the season when they're both both healthy from week 8 on. You only saw Puka Nacua get double-digit targets once. You saw Cooper Kupp get it 3 times. Now, it might be semantics where it's 1.5, 2 targets, but that's the numbers we're looking at. And then it comes to how many top 5 finishes do they have. Cooper Kupp had 2 top 5 finishes during that time frame, while Puka only had 1. So there's a lot of things there where I'm looking at. I think Cooper Kupp is the 1A. Dan talked about 1A, 1B. I think Cooper Kupp is the 1A until I see him not healthy. And everything I've heard is offseason is there's no hamstring issues, there's no tightrope surgeries recovering from. That Puka Nacua is training with Cooper Kupp to get better shape. So I'm excited about Cooper Kupp because every time I've seen him on the field be healthy, he is a stud. And I think anything, I might have him a little too low. Puka's awesome too, top 15, top 17. I have no problem arguing that. But as the guy who's been more receiver in the Rams, barring injury, I think it's still Cooper Kupp.
Okay, Bob. So let me know who you agree with more.
That was fairly compelling, Chris. It swayed me more than I expected. I'm still Team Puka, but I think I'm going to probably close the gap a little bit in my rankings.
Look at that. Look at that. Chris swaying the guess. Good work by you. I do want to add in here, it's not a small sample size we had last season where Puka Nacua was still outscoring Cooper Kupp. And Kupp at 31 years old, yes, he's in great shape now. We haven't gotten training camp yet. So this all may change coming up. But Chris, compelling points by you as to why Kupp is not in the dust. And I think that's more of an important point here. I have him ranked at 22, but there's a lot of people ADP-wise who have Kupp at 22, but don't want to touch him. I'm not one of those people. If he falls to me in that third round, I am hitting the hit button on Cooper Kupp for some of the reasons that Chris has been laying out. But let's get into our next.
I'm betting on Chase being right, but that was a hell of an argument.
Yep, I totally agree. Let's get into our next show. We're just ripping them off in this section of the show. All right, so we have another wide receiver that we're going to debate. And this time, it's me versus Adam over Deebo, Samuel. Bob, once again, will be judging our picks. Bob's a great judge on these debates. But Adam, you got him at wide receiver 30. Whoa. You just hate some Deebo Samuel there. So walk me through, why is Deebo so low on your list compared to ADP, which has him at wide receiver 14?
Look, I think that the San Francisco 49ers will continue to be the most efficient offense in the NFL, but I struggle to project it to be as efficient as last year. They have to take a step back in some capacity in terms of efficiency. Look, the trend line in Deebo's targets, rushes, just overall opportunities has been heading down for 3 years. Like, all of it's gone down. And that's despite the fact that he played more games last season than the season prior. The opportunities still went down just on totals, not percentages, totals, playing more games season to season. That's not to say that Deebo wasn't fantastic last year. Of course he was. On a points per game basis, he was a wide receiver 1, and it was even better down the stretch. As long as you don't make it to the playoffs when you talk about down the stretch, in which case, playoffs were a dud on the whole. No touchdowns. We had like 9 carries. He was like less than his normal yards per carry by a pretty significant margin. I think he had 150 receiving yards in the entire playoffs. And this was a team that made it through a good chunk of the playoffs. So the playoffs were abysmal. So what I'm saying, not necessarily is that the playoffs mean that, that's who Deebo is, but that the stretch he had right before the playoffs isn't necessarily who Deebo is either. It probably is living somewhere in the middle. I think Deebo is going to continue to be one of the most talented two-way players our league has. It just happens to be that he shares a team with the most talented two-way player in the NFL. And so for me, I think it's not likely that he has the points per game that he had last year, where he did make it into the back end of as a wide receiver 1 on a points per game basis and half-point PPR, because I don't think that the touchdowns are going to continue. He had a spike in touchdowns, not like his crazy spike year a couple years ago, but there's that year, there's last year, and every other year he gets 2, 3, maybe 4, 5 touchdowns, like at maximum. I don't see him repeating last year's touchdowns, especially as, once again, his volume is just diminishing. And as far as the Aiyuk situation, this is one that could absolutely go in a bunch of different directions. Because if Aiyuk's gone, then Deebo's a certified wide receiver 1, and the whole board's effed. Not to say the other word. The whole board's effed. But if Aiyuk stays, and Aiyuk gets the money he's asking, well, then suddenly I feel like the targets that Aiyuk is almost certainly asking for are going to follow. And then I think that trend line for the opportunities of Deebo continues to go in the direction of, okay, maybe this year he gets 80 targets. Maybe this year he gets 30 carries. And for me, just the odds of the touchdowns not tailing off back to, what's been normal for him, which is, normal years has been closer to, we can pull it up, like 3 to 5, maybe 6 touchdowns, not 7 receiving and a handful more on the ground. Just especially as the rushing usage tails off, which has consistently tailed off. I think that's the scariest part, because that's the way he's been able to get in the end zone most consistently. So for me, it's not a knock on the player. It's that unless Brock Purdy's pushing for 10 yards per attempt, something's got to give, which he did last year. Look, he might make 9, which is still fantastic. Historic. To do 9 back-to-back years would be freaking incredible. I don't think he pushes 10, dude. I can't be that efficient on this offense.
Well, the beauty part with Deebo Samuel is that he doesn't have to push 10 because Deebo's not dependent on the ADOT. He's dependent on what he does after the catch. That's always been the big key. And you talk about the touchdowns. Yes, receiving touchdowns never been particularly high, but this is a guy you have to remember, he's going to get a handful of rushing touchdowns. He had 12 total touchdowns last year with 5 rushing. He had 3 rushing the year before, and that was his low year when he played his least amount of games. Here's the other thing. You got now you do have Brandon Aiyuk lower than the rest of us, but you still have Brandon Aiyuk at wide receiver 23. As great of a receiver as Brandon Aiyuk is, he has never, ever outperformed Deebo Samuel on a fantasy points per game basis because couple things. One, Deebo, because he is a two-way player, out-touches Brandon Aiyuk more consistently. In fact, even last season, as great as Aiyuk was, he was only averaging about 6.5 targets or even opportunities, you could frame it for Aiyuk, while Deebo's getting 8.4 opportunities per week. He gets 126 opportunities for the entire season, even with 3 games missed. That makes him the second most utilized player on the great San Francisco 49ers offense. Deebo's not your typical wide receiver. You can't look at him that way. He's going to be a two-way player who gets utilized. And I think part of them using less of Christian McCaffrey is not using Elijah Mitchell, who always gets hurt every time he touches the ball more. It's giving more touches in that situation to Deebo Samuel. And for Deebo, all it's been coming down to over his career, and we'll go back to Chris with the Cooper Kupp argument, is whether or not he's in shape, not healthy, in shape. He was in shape in 2021. He was a wide receiver 2 overall. He was in shape last year. He was a wide receiver 9 on a fantasy points per game basis. Every indication this season is that Deebo's in even better shape coming into this season than he was last year right now from all the reports so far. This offense could go down in efficiency. Maybe it comes up in an uptick in pace. They were the 31st pace last season. Brock Purdy, another year where he gets to be healthy. You don't think that pace quickens up and that comes with more volume for some of these guys? Look, Brandon Aiyuk, maybe he gets the contract done. Kyle Shanahan's never been a guy who divvies out his opportunities to players who are making the most. It's all about his offense and the way it functions. As long as Deebo Samuel's there, he's the more consistent player of the two when it comes to utilization. So for Deebo Samuel, as long as he's in shape, I'm going with him as a top 12 wide receiver. Bob, go ahead.
I'm getting a call here from Marcus Grant, who would like to know best shape of his career season is a fallacy. We're not That's an axe Marcus likes to grind. I don't want to like Deebo Samuel. Like, I honestly don't. I want to be on Adam's side of this one, but I think more realistically, Dan has won this one. No, this is not a reprisal for your harsh attack at DeMarcus Robinson earlier, Adam, although that did shade my opinion a little bit, not going to lie. But because I'm not in, you're not going to find me drafting Deebo where he goes. I'm interested in other pieces. But I think the argument that Dan made is pretty fair. So we'll give it to Dan and say that, Adam, you were not wrong, sir. You just went a little low.
All right. With that, let's talk quickly a little bit about the Brandon Aiyuk situation. Bob, I'd love to get your opinion on this. I think I share the opinion that you have. Yes, he requested a trade, and this is we're just going to talk about from an NFL standpoint because, again, we all have Brandon Aiyuk ranked as a wide receiver 2, essentially, so we're not really dissimilar as far as where his value is concerned. But, yeah, so he requested a trade. What do you make of that situation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, the word is the 49ers have no intention of trading him, which means, obviously, if they got the right offer, they would. Grant Cohen from SI.com threw out there recently that when they're negotiating with him, they talk about him as if he's a high-end wide receiver 2. When they're negotiating with other teams for a trade, he's a high-end wide receiver 1. They want that first-round draft capital. So, again, everyone I've talked to, including the Athletics' Matt Barrow, thinks this is who, by the way, told me that they've offered him slightly less than the $28 million that Amon-Ra St. Brown got from Detroit earlier this year. That's going to be the sticking point, and they need to start talking again. I feel like this is going to get done at some point because this is just the way the 49ers do it. We can go back to Deebo's contract. Was the eve of training camp, Nick Bosa last year. And you want to keep Aiyuk around, among the league's most efficient receivers last year, top 3 in yards per catch, yards per route run, yards per target, explosive reception rate, all those things. Finishes fantasy's wide receiver 13. We're still drafting him at a ceiling. I don't like drafting him there either right now, with that little bit of uncertainty, but still a very good player and a very good offense. And probably much like Deebo, I won't be having too many shares of him, at least not until things get resolved.
Yeah, that part I can't disagree with. Look, as it comes down to, he's still under contract. The 49ers can elect to franchise tag him next year at $22 million projected right now, which would still be a bargain for an elite level wide receiver. So the 49ers they hold all the cards. I don't think we're going to see Brandon Aiyuk in a different uniform. But kind of touch on Bob point real quick. I am over recent years backing off of players who hold out, hold in, whatever they decide to do. If they do not have a efficient enough or essentially proficient enough ramp up time. Look, these guys are in shape. They're working out all the time, but there's a difference between working out on your own and actually getting in football shape. You need time to do that. Now, if he misses 1 week of training camp and he's back in there, no, I'm not going to be concerned. But if this goes 2 weeks, 3 weeks into training camp, I'm going to be moving Brandon Aiyuk down a little bit on my list just to talk about that for a second. Let's get into DK Metcalf on Seattle. Somebody I'm very intrigued by, somebody I'm very excited by. Chase, you have him ranked on the lowest on the list, though. So what's going on with you and DK Metcalf? You have him at wide receiver 22.
I've got him at wide receiver 22. That's about where his ADP is right now. He's ranked 20th ECR right now. But listen, I've got him ranked as a mid to low wide receiver too. This is a team, I mentioned it earlier, they ran the second fewest times. They rushed the ball the second fewest times in the league last season. They were only 17th in pass attempts. This is not a team that had a ton of offensive plays. When they hired Ryan Grubb, I think everybody thought, oh, hey, air raid offense coming in and they're going to bomb the ball all over the place. Well, insofar as this Seattle offense resembles in any way the University of Washington offense from last year, yes, DK Metcalf is going to be the Rome Odunze in this offense, okay? Which means he's still going to be the number one receiver on this team. All right, they're going to be passing. We expect them. I mean, they hired Mike McDonald, the defensive coach, as their head coach because I think they're disappointed in their defense. They want that to get better, but I think this is a team that's still going to be trailing. They are going to throw the ball, but Grubb came out and he said, we are going to be a more physical team. We are going to establish the run. And when you've got Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, that's not necessarily a bad way to look at things. His offense does a good job of opening up lanes for runners. We touched on that earlier. We've already established that. But I mean, how many more pass attempts are they going to really have? They've still got Geno Smith as their quarterback. DK Metcalf is going to be their number one. You know what that meant last year? It meant he was a mid to low wide receiver 2. You know what it meant the year before that? It meant he was a mid to low wide receiver 2 on a points per game basis. I think we always look at DK Metcalf and we think that he's going to be that 2020 receiver that we got that was a bona fide wide receiver 1. And again, the talent is there. I don't necessarily think at this juncture right now that that's where his opportunity is. So again, I mean, I don't have him as a high wide receiver 2 like the rest of you do, but I still have him as a wide receiver 2. And if any of us can draft him at his current ADP, we're all going to be very happy.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, Bob, you have him a little bit higher. Are you having some higher expectations, maybe some anticipation there with the Ryan Grubb system and how that might benefit DK Metcalf?
Yeah, I do think, and all, I mean, maybe Ryan Grubb changes, the leopard changes its stripes. You're welcome, Emmitt Smith. Grubb called passing plays 61.8% of the time over his last 2 seasons in Washington. They're 15th in dropback percentage, and they operate at a higher rate of speed. So there's going to be more plays, hopefully, this year. I'm hopeful, right? I do think I would rather draft him at his ADP, but we're talking about a guy. We all know the number, 6'4", 235 pounds. Last year, the fastest speed in the NFL, 22.23 miles per hour on a 73-yard touchdown run. I think he'll lean into that speed and those physical attributes and get a little heavier usage. And we'll see him a little closer to the higher end of what we've seen in the past. As Chase mentioned, I mean, we've seen him push up into that wide receiver 1 range. I think we get closer to that this year.
And Dan, I think the route tree is different. I think that's the key from my book, where I think you're going to see different DK Metcalf also moving forward.
We got a nice question coming in here from Frozen Gaming. I'm in a tough 12-man team, 2-keeper league. I have Chase, Henry, and the first pick. Best available is Saquon, Harrison, and Garrett Wilson. I'm not sure who to draft. They're all great choices. I'm sticking with Chase. I'm big on Henry this year, so admittedly, I might be a little bit biased in this scenario, but I think I'm just sticking with Chase and Henry. I'm assuming he's saying that as he has Chase and Henry, 2-keeper, and the first pick. So I guess who would you guys go with the first pick? Whoever wants to jump in here. Just for my 2 cents, I'm leaning Garrett Wilson, but somebody else can jump in here, Bob. Yeah.
Same. I go Garrett Wilson.
I go Garrett Wilson.
All right, there you go, Frozen Gaming. We got Garrett Wilson for you with that first pick. All right, I want to cap off the wide receivers here. We got to talk about Marvin Harrison a little bit. Adam, you have him as a top 12 wide receiver, even though he's a rookie wide receiver. That's a shout out to all the old guys out there. How can it work? How can a rookie wide receiver be ranked in the top 12? Why you got him in the top 12?
Yeah, because he's going to be an immediate target hog. I mean, he fits everything you would want to see, right? Like, one, almost a spitting image skill set wise. Like, he's not yet future Hall of Famer DeAndre Hopkins, but like, as far as a receiver, you couldn't really pick a rookie who more stylistically resembled DeAndre Hopkins, who worked really well. Maybe not in the touchdown category, but on the whole worked really well with Kyler Murray. So I think this is a skill set that can work. He's a monster, especially on intermediate. He's one of the best route runners in the draft. I'm just not really worried about anything with him. Even AJ Green was a really popular comp. And look, AJ Green didn't necessarily blow anyone out of the water in Arizona, but I think he, at least I'll say this for myself and for you guys who I've done the show with for a while now, I think this is true of you as well. AJ Green, at the very least, overdid expectations with Kyler Murray, which goes to show that this is like a skill set that Kyler feels very comfortable with. I think Kyler, again, is going to throw the ball to Marvin Harrison quite a bit. We don't even need to talk about the competition in the receiver room or lack thereof to really get to that point, because Marvin Harrison is that good. This is a A-tier blue chip prospect and one who right out of the gate is going to be the wide receiver one, the X, the potentially outright, like, the offense is built around this player. I don't think it would be that crazy if the identity of this offense, the like glue of this offense, is Marvin Harrison Jr. So yeah, I'm all in. I think he is a year one wide receiver one.
Bob, any issue, any questions about, any flags about, Marvin Harrison being a rookie, having this expectation on a rookie wide receiver? We didn't have it on Chase, and we didn't even necessarily have it on Jefferson from drafting standpoint.
Being old, mean, and cheap, I don't like to pay up. I want a discount. Marvin Harrison, we're paying for a perceived ceiling. We do that with rookies. I'm going to make the same argument here that I did make strenuously last year. Bijan Robinson, I thought, was a great prospect, and he was going well into the first round of drafts. Jahmyr Gibbs, based on draft capital and all the things, Jahmyr Gibbs, similar draft capital, buying him 3 rounds later turned out to be a pretty good thing. I will have more 4th round Malik Neighbors than I have second or late 1st round or early 2nd round Marvin Harrison Jr., even if I think he's going to be really good. I'm going to get the guy that I think is going to be just as good. And I know the quarterback issues. Adam Thielen would like you to know you can be wide receiver 18 playing with the worst quarterback in the NFL, people.
At least for the first 12 games of the season.
At least for the first 12 games of the season. Right.
All right. So with that, let's head into the tight ends here. We're going to talk about 2 of them. Well, off the top, we got George Kittle. Of course, everybody on the 49ers, a fantasy asset. Chris, you have him the highest of us. You have him ranked at tight end 3, oddly enough, where he finished last season. So what is it? If we all think the efficiency of the 49ers has to come down, why does George Kittle buck that compared to everybody else?
Well, number one, you didn't hear me say the efficiency of the 49ers had to come down. I wasn't on one of those.
That's true. We did not hear you on that. That's fair.
And number 2, George Kittle was a guy who went over 1,000 yards at tight end position last year. Whoa. Turning the end screens upside down on that one. We saw George Kittle go over 1,000 yards last year as a tight end position. It was something that we don't see very often in the tight end position last year. I think one other guy went over 1,000 yards last year. And then we have a guy that also is a guy that had 11 touchdowns the previous season. So we still like him to be a red zone efficiency guy. You see a connection with him and Brock Purdy, and that's my biggest thing. I know we lost Dan for there, but he's a 49ers fan. And we've seen, George Kittle gets forgotten about by Kyle Shanahan in the offense. But one thing we've seen kind of a resurgence for over the last, since Brock Purdy became the starter, is George Kittle usually has some involvement, particularly in some big plays. And George Kittle's that tight end that can win a week for you. There's going to be some low weeks here or there, but every tight end usually has that outside the top 1 or 2. But what you're going to look for is the guys who can get you those boom games. George Kittle had, 5 games, over 19 points and half-point PPR last year. A guy who could definitely dominate tight end position. And a guy I know he had injuries, concerns this offseason, but played 17 games last year. This team kind of is the heart and soul of this offense. I know they're going to look for different ways to kind of have other guys maybe to block a little bit here or there. But George Kittle is a guy that, as long as he's healthy and on the field, is a threat that get you big time yardage, and a red zone guy and a Brock Purdy favorite. If anything happens to this passing attack, or Brandon Aiyuk's out, or Deebo Samuel's out, or whatever happens, Court Kittle is going to continue to benefit from that. And if we see any regression in Christian McCaffrey's usage in the red zone, all the rushing touchdown opportunities he had, maybe a couple of those with George Kittle, and suddenly you have a huge difference from 7 touchdowns to 9 touchdowns. And we have a guy who was number 1 last year. So George Kittle to me is a guy that I see a lot of consistency the last 3 years, and a guy that has a lot of upside as well. So until those wheels fall off, I'm not jumping off George Kittle.
So I have him. I think me and Adam have him at 7. Chase, you have him at 6. You're the outlier. Dan also at 7. What do you like about him at 6?
Well, again, I mean, like we said, he finished that high last year. He could finish that high. We know he has that ability. It's just that I'm much bigger on George Kittle, I think, in, say, like a best ball formats, because of, like what Chris said, those boom bust weeks that he has. He'll have weeks where we know he can go off for 2-3 touchdowns and 100+ yards. And then we'll have other weeks where it seems like they forgot that he's even on the field with them. But overall, the talent is there. He's always on the field. He's still one of their top 4 offensive players, talent-wise, period. So, I mean, I still like George Kittle as a tight end 1. I just like him a little bit lower than Chris's 3.
That seems reasonable. Chris, you have Trey McBride as a tight end 8. You have some splaining to do. The rest of us are all higher. I'm kind of like, I'm thinking Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be a limiting factor here. Maybe everyone else agrees with that, but is that your primary argument for having him?
That's a big part of it. I mean, what we saw Trey McBride become was basically the offense outside James Conner for the Arizona Cardinals. Marquise Brown going down with injury. Who were you going to replace him with? Zach Pascal? There was no receiver to throw the ball to but Trey McBride. And the upside, even with all those targets, was what I'm kind of struggling with. I'm big on seeing guys, can you get me big boom games when you get the target opportunities? 10 catches or 95 yards and half-point PPR is awesome. How often is that going to happen for a tight end position? Not consistently for Trey McBride. So that's where I have some concerns. Or are you going to be this offense for this team versus, as Adam alluded to, Marvin Harrison, I do think will be the target hog for this offense. And Trey McBride, that he kind of replacing him in that sense. And then touchdowns, get 3. So I already seen a guy have 6, 11, 6 in the last 3 years. I had to see this guy double his touchdown production from last year, and I have to hope that it's going to, definitely improve and consistently what he did from last year as well. So Trey McBride to me is a guy that I don't have, I like the upside. I like what we've seen, but I'm not going to buy necessarily that just because he had a good stretch last year, that suddenly Trey McBride's the guy you have to have.
All right. Well, I'm here in spirit, guys. You can't see my screen, but I am here in spirit. My camera just does not want to turn on. Great explanations there with you, but I want to wrap this show up with our underdog specials.
You didn't see that coming?
All right. Remember, if you have not signed up for Underdog yet, do so. When you use the promo code FFAdvice, you get up to $250 cash, a bonus, and a free pick'em bet. And these are all your props that you could bet on Underdog Fantasy. First up, we got Brock Purdy, higher than 28.5 passing touchdowns. That is juiced to 1.1 times your money. He's at a 7.9% touchdown rate since becoming a starter halfway through the 2022 season. Just as many weapons and is healthier going into this year. DK Metcalf over 1,025.5 yards. He's been over that 3 of the last 4 years. To Chase's point, even if he's not going to get the production or the volume, I guess we should say, that he wants, this is still a guy who consistently gets over 1,000 yards receiving despite the other mouths to feed. Trey McBride, higher than 750.5 yards, will at least be the number 2 target on the team. Became a full-time starter in week 8 with 10 starts. From that point on, he produced 655 yards, and that was only in 10 games. It was a pace of 1,100. We could see significant regression, and he still hit the over on his 750.5 receiving yard prop. And that is your underdog special. Just because you can't see my face doesn't mean we didn't have a great time. Bob, I want to thank you so much for coming on. Tell the people what you got working on, where they should be checking you out, and we can't wait to see you at the Expo again this season.
I will be there at the Expo. Looking forward to having a good time. King's Classic Draft's always a blast for me, and all the other festivities, which are copious and growing with each passing years. You can find me at Football Guys on the Audible channel, on the YouTube. My weekly fantasy notebook column available free of charge there at the site every week. So kind of check that out. Also, you can hear me in about an hour from now on SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. Mike Dempsey and myself will be on the Football Diehard Show. We're on 5 nights this week. We'll go to our 4 nights a week next week, every night, 10 to midnight, except Tuesday. So be ready for that. And then once the season starts, you will be so sick of me, it will be impossible to escape me. I will be on 6 days a week of radio. And by the way, I got a new thing coming out of Football Guys, a daily audio update for in the morning, just kind of a quick news update that I think you'll all enjoy. So check it all out.
Make sure you are checking out Bob. Bob, we can never get sick of you, okay? We want more and more Bob. And the best thing about radio, you don't have the video issues that I'm dealing with right now either. Make sure you guys check us out next week. We'll be back with Brian Scott, Dr. Brian Scott. We're going to give you a breakdown of all the injuries and the fantasy value that comes with it for every team going into the season. It's going to be a big one and a fast-paced show. Make sure you check us out on the Fantasy Football Advice Network YouTube page. Check out Operation Domination on your favorite podcast app. We're available to you on every podcast that you listen to. Give us all a follow on social media, and everyone have a great weekend. Hey there, I'm proud to say that Underdog Fantasy is the newest sponsor of our show, and it's my favorite place to play fantasy games. No waivers, no trades, no lineup settings, just best ball for season-long drafters all year long. And you gotta check out Pick'em. It's so easy to play. Just pick 2 to 5 stats of your favorite players. You can choose whether they go higher or lower on those stats, and if you can pick 5 in a row, you can win 20 times your money. Sound like fun? Well, guess what? You can sign up with promo code FFAdvice today to claim your special pick, plus a first-time deposit offer up to $250 in bonus cash. I cannot wait to see your entries.